Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So in Western cultures, parents reckon praise is an important part of raising kids. For example, close to 90% of parents think that kids need praise in order to build their self-esteem. Now this belief is not without merit. For example, in meta-analytic reviews, the use of praise has been shown to be an effective way of getting kids to see themselves more positively. However, not all praise is equal. In this video, I'll take you through the research that's investigated the best way to give kids praise. As you'll see, 3 types of praise will be under the microscope. I'll start off with person versus process praise and then move on to inflated praise. So several studies have been carried out to investigate the potentially different impact of 2 types of praise. One type of praise is known as person praise, and this concerns praise focused on personal attributes of a child. For example, your kid solves a problem and you say, "You're so clever." The other type of praise is known as process praise, and this concerns praise focused on the amount of effort put in or strategies used when a child does something. For example, your kid solves a puzzle and you say, "You worked really hard." In this research, it's argued that person praise is bad and process praise is good. Specifically, person praise is thought to be bad because it may end up in a kid thinking that success results solely from particular personal attributes, and that these attributes are something that they must have to be worthwhile. To illustrate, suppose you praise your kid for being smart. "You're so smart." If the kid fails a test, then as a result of this praise, they'll think that this failure is due to them not being smart, leading to them feeling crappy about themselves and being more likely to stop trying. In contrast, process praise is thought to be good because it will end up in a kid thinking that their success is a result of their effort or strategies. So if a kid fails, then they'll attribute this failure to not having tried hard enough or not having gone about things the best way. And as a consequence, they won't beat themselves up too much, or at least less than they would have if they received person praise, and they're going to be more likely to persist in the face of failure. Now initially this all sounded sensible, but when I thought about it, it seemed reasonable to think that person praise would only be a bad thing if the personal attribute being praised was something that the kid had little control over. That is, person praise might not necessarily be bad. It might depend upon whether the attribute being praised is something that is fixed versus changeable. For example, if the person praise is focused on an attribute that's relatively fixed, such as intelligence, then this might be bad, because you can't decide to wake up tomorrow and be as smart as Albert Einstein. But if the person praise is focused on an attribute that's relatively changeable, such as effort, then this might not be bad because you can probably wake up tomorrow and try harder at something. That is, you probably got a better chance of going from lazy to hardworking than going from dumbass to genius. So I'm not fully sold on the arguments put forward, but nevertheless, in the following, I'll review some of the key papers that have investigated the impact of person versus process praise. And I'll start with the impact of person versus process praise on achievement-related behaviors and beliefs. So a key paper in this area was by Mueller and Dweck. In this paper, the researchers investigated whether person versus process praise had a differential impact on kids' achievement-related behaviors and beliefs in the light of failure. Specifically, what the researchers were interested in was impact on explanations of failure, level of enjoyment when completing a challenging task, willingness to persist with a challenging task, and actual task performance. So Mueller and Dweck carried out 6 studies, and across these studies they recruited kids who ranged in age from 9 to 11 years. To determine whether person versus process praise has a differential impact on kids' achievement-related behaviors and beliefs, having had a failure experience, a basic approach that could be adopted would be as follows. First, give kids a task that they'll do well at so that you have a reason to give them praise, and then give some kids person praise and others process praise. Second, give kids a task that they can't do well at, so they have a failure experience. And third, at this point, because kids have been given praise and have then had a failure, you can now assess whatever it is you're interested in to determine any differential impact of person versus process praise. And this, of course, was the approach adopted by Mueller and Dweck. And here are the details. So kids initially completed 2 sets of problems. The first set was relatively easy because the researchers wanted kids to start off with a success experience, which they could then be given praise for. After completing this first set, kids were given standardized feedback indicating that they performed well. In addition, and this is the key experimental manipulation, some kids were praised for being smart, person praise, whereas other kids were praised for trying hard, process praise. Next, the kids completed the second set of problems, and this set was harder than the first so that the kids had a failure experience. At this point, the researchers assessed a bunch of outcomes they were interested in. Specifically, they assessed kids' explanations for their performance, how much the kids enjoyed doing the problems, and how much they wanted to keep doing the problems. And finally, to assess whether person versus process praise had a different impact on task performance following a failure experience, the kids were given a third set of problems which was similar in difficulty as the first set. So across the studies, the results were generally consistent and showed the following. Compared to kids given process praise, kids given person praise were more likely to attribute failure to their ability as opposed to effort, said that they enjoyed the task less, were less likely to persist with the task, and performed slightly worse. And similar results have been obtained in a bunch of other studies, although at least one study has not replicated the results. And there is some suggestion that the effects may extend to very young kids. So in summary, the findings of these studies are consistent with the idea that, compared to process praise, person praise has a detrimental impact on kids' achievement-related behaviours and beliefs. So now onto the impact of person versus process praise on kids' self-esteem. So more recent studies have looked at the impact of person versus process praise on kids' self-esteem. And the approach for doing so has been similar to the basic methodology used in the studies just mentioned. That is, have kids do something well, give them praise, and then look at the impact of that praise. In this case, in terms of what kids think of themselves, following a subsequent experience. So Brummelman recruited about 300 kids aged 8 to 13 years old who were required to complete a simple online game against an opponent from another school. And the opponent was fake. The kids first completed a practice round, after which they were given person praise or process praise. They then completed a competitive round, with half of the kids winning and half of the kids losing. The results were rigged. Finally, they were asked how they were feeling about themselves. The results showed that the action was in those kids who experienced failure, they lost, rather than those kids who experienced success, they won. And that existing levels of self-esteem mattered. Specifically, in kids who had high self-esteem and experienced failure, there was no difference between person praise and process praise in terms of how kids thought of themselves. However, in kids who had low self-esteem and experienced failure, those who were given person praise thought more negatively about themselves compared to kids who were given process praise. So these results suggest that person praise can have a detrimental impact on how kids think about themselves, but only if they experience failure and only if they have low self-esteem. Now, the results of this study are relevant in that Brummelman found that parents are more likely to give kids with low self-esteem person praise than kids with high self-esteem. As the results of the previous study suggest, this approach may be unhelpful, making kids with low self-esteem feel worse about themselves rather than better when they experience failure. So now on to inflated praise. So in this next section, I'll review studies that have investigated the impact of inflated praise on kids. And inflated praise is simply praise that's over the top. For example, suppose your kid has done a painting and you say, "That looks really good," versus you say, "That looks absolutely fantastic, amazing work, blah, 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 blah." The latter would be inflated praise. There is some research suggesting that parents use inflated praise more often with kids who have low self-esteem compared to kids who have high self-esteem. For example, Brummelman found that across 2 studies, parents used inflated praise about 25% of the time. However, this effect depended upon the child's level of self-esteem, with parents using inflated praise more often with kids who had low self-esteem, about 35% of the time, than with kids who had high self-esteem, about 20% of the time. Given that parents may use inflated praise more often with kids who have low self-esteem, the issue becomes, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So a few studies have looked at inflated praise in the context of kids' self-esteem. In this research, the approach has been either to assess the amount and type of praise that parents give to kids and kids' self-esteem. The other approach has been like the previous research, where investigators have gotten kids to do something, then given them praise, and finally examined the subsequent impact of that praise. So first up, Brummelman recruited 120 kids aged 7 to 11 years old. As part of a home observation, the kids were required to complete a bunch of maths questions administered by their parents, with this maths session video recorded. The researchers subsequently watched the recording and assessed how frequently the parents used inflated praise versus non-inflated praise. And self-esteem was assessed using standardized questionnaires. The researchers found that higher use of inflated praise was associated with lower levels of self-esteem. In a related study, Brummelman investigated whether inflated praise results in a reduced tendency to engage in challenging tasks, especially in kids with low self-esteem. So these researchers recruited 240 8 to 12-year-old kids who varied in terms of their levels of self-esteem. The kids were first required to draw a picture, which was then judged by an expert painter. Not actually an expert, just a stooge for the study. This expert either gave them inflated praise or non-inflated praise. And finally, kids were required to draw other pictures, but they got to choose which pictures to draw. Half the pictures were challenging to draw, whereas the other half were easy to draw. The results showed that, when given inflated praise, kids with low levels of self-esteem were less likely to choose the challenging drawings than kids with high levels of self-esteem. However, when given non-inflated praise, kids with low levels of self-esteem were more likely to choose the challenging drawings than kids with high levels of self-esteem. So trying to pump kids up with over-the-top praise may not be helpful, especially if a kid has low self-esteem. So finally, the impact of inflated praise on kids' achievement and depression levels. So to finish up, Lee ran a study that looked at the association between the use of inflated praise versus deflated praise versus accurate praise on academic performance and depression. As mentioned, inflated praise is when you amp up the praise, deflated praise is when you tone down the praise, and accurate praise is calibrated to the kid's achievement. So the study was straightforward. The researchers asked 300 kids in years 3 to 5 the type of praise their parents tended to give them for their academic performance. They got the kids' grades and they assessed their levels of depression. They found that kids who received high levels of inflated praise and kids who received high levels of deflated praise performed worse academically than kids who received accurate praise. Likewise, kids who received high levels of inflated praise and kids who received high levels of deflated praise reported higher levels of depression symptoms than kids who received accurate praise. So these results suggest that there may be a sweet spot somewhere between under and over praising, though the results are only correlational, so you don't want to get too carried away. But for the moment, that's it for the best way to praise. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.